Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the ASX and Sectors weekly chart analysis for the week ending 17th of April 2026. The first chart is the S&P ASX 200 index, the XJO. This is the parent index of the Australian Stock Exchange. And price really spent the week in consolidation mode this week, trading right up in the highs of the previous bar's range, which is generally a sign of strength. You can see that the breakdown line, the previous breakdown line, has clearly been exceeded last week, and the market is consolidating in response. And that's a pretty good outcome, to be honest. Volume remained about the average. That was genuine trading. Would have perhaps preferred to see that slightly lower, but it might also suggest that some buying support has emerged, and it wasn't necessarily a complete test for supply below the previous bar's close. It was just as much absorption and buying support, which is some form of accumulation. But all in all, that was relatively strong, and it has been relatively strong over the last month since this bar here, where buying support definitely emerged. There was some testing for supply below its close, a push higher, modest challenge to the breakdown line, and then the following week, the market just broke higher. There was no test for supply, and this week's a consolidation bar, an absorption bar, and perhaps there's some accumulation in there as well, with the volume increasing to about the average. So that was a pretty good move. This is the mid-cap sector. You can see the market here did properly test for supply below the previous bar's close this week. Here's the breakdown line, which the parent index is well above now. It's a similar story though. Buying support did emerge here. There was some testing for supply and some absorption in this bar, which continued last week as price pushed higher, and you've had a test for supply this week. And it's a fairly positive test for supply because the market has closed just slightly above the previous bar's close and has respected its high. So that's quite a positive move as well. The door is open for an attempt to break out above that breakdown line. The market's certainly well placed to do so. It'll just require some favourable trading conditions. This is the small ordinaries sector, and this market very similar to the mid caps. Buying supports emerged. There was some testing for supply and absorption in this bar. Here's the breakdown line. This week has seen the market test for supply below the previous bar's close, and in quite a positive manner has then moved higher and actually slightly above the previous bar's high. This market's also well placed to issue a challenge to the breakdown line and attempt to break out above it. It'll also require more favourable trading conditions or continuing favourable trading conditions for the market to move higher and attempt to break out. This is the ASX financial sector, easily the largest sector in the Australian Stock Exchange. And the market moved up higher last week. It's pulled back to consolidate this week. I do note that supply was drawn out on these two bars in the background when there was an attempt to push above this bar's high. You can see that here, the supply was drawn out. They were very high volume bars, yet the market didn't make very much ground higher at all, and in fact pulled back in response. That forced the market to consolidate for a period like this. It pushed up last week, back up to this level, and there has been some supply drawn out again at this level. And price was forced to pull back and attempt to consolidate. So that's just worth noting. You can see that volume increased this week. The market made an attempt to push higher above the previous bar's close. That failed, and price pushed lower to consolidate within the previous bar's range for the remainder of the week. So there has been some supply drawn out again at this level. So keep watching that and see if that continues. This is the metals and mining subsector, and this market did close higher this week, albeit only slightly. The market traded below the previous bar's close, testing for supply earlier in the week, and then pushed higher in response. Volume did increase to above the average, just slightly, yet the market wasn't able to use that increased force or effort to push higher, and it closed pretty much adjacent to the previous bar's high. That suggests there is some supply in this market, and the positive close here, up high in the range, does suggest the market's attempting to absorb or buy that supply that's being drawn out. That supply has kept the spread or range quite narrow this week. I won't be surprised to see the market come back just slightly and test for supply early in the week if there is supply being drawn out of this market. If supply is found to be low, there's probably going to be an attempt to push higher. But if supply continues to be drawn out, there may be a deeper pullback to challenge those sellers. So just be aware that some supply has been drawn out of this market. There's an attempt to absorb that supply, but it's not yet resolved as to which side will hold the upper hand, the buyers or the sellers. It does appear that the buyers may be holding a slight upper hand at this point in time, but just watch for a confirmation of that. This is the ASX gold sector, and you can see that the market has consolidated in response to last week's bar. This is effectively one bar over 2 weeks, and this is a period of consolidation in response. Breakdown line comes through here, and you can see that the market's respecting that breakdown line in the background. It pushed up to it last week, and it's testing for supply just below it this week, which is exactly what you expect to see. Volume was below the average. It was slightly increased, but it remained below the average, so selling pressure isn't a factor here. This market was attempting to absorb any supply below the breakdown line, and that will open the door for a challenge to that level if selling pressure remains low and trading conditions are favourable. This is the ASX energy sector, and it also traded in consolidation mode this week, attempting to absorb supply. There was certainly supply being drawn out. It's had a pretty good run, this sector, and you can see that the market sort of stalled out a bit here. There was a test for supply in this bar, didn't really work out. Supply was drawn out on that bar. The market's attempted to consolidate in response. It did pull back in response to the supply being drawn out, but the close well off that week's low does suggest that there was a strong attempt to absorb or buy that supply that was being drawn out. That was likely profit taking from a good run. And this week, the market's made a modest attempt to move higher. It's then faded lower and continued to close pretty much adjacent to the previous bar's close on slightly reduced, about average volume. So the market's making a strong attempt to absorb the supply being drawn out from the sellers. You may find there's a little test for supply early in the week next week, just to confirm that those sellers are done. If they're not, you may find this low tested. If they are done, the market may continue sideways or even attempt to push higher again. You've got that level going through there. So there's your zone where the market's likely to trade. If supply is drawn out, it's going to be down here. And if supply appears to be relatively low now, this is the highs of the range. This is where supply was drawn out in the past. There might be some resistance here from sellers who are locked in there and haven't sold yet. But I expect they're probably selling over those last 2 weeks. And most of the resistance will have already been removed. This is the ASX health sector, and it's attempting to consolidate sideways within the range of this bar where some buying support has emerged. Every week I keep pointing out that this market has not been trading in a particularly strong fashion for some time. It's attempted to consolidate sideways numerous times and failed, and it's attempting to do so right at this point in time. It was obvious almost straight away when this bar emerged on an increase in volume like this that some buying support had emerged in this market, and since then it's traded sideways, but there's no obvious sign of an attempt to break out. And until that happens and you get some testing and then a further push higher, I would be just watching this market and seeing what happens in response, because it's shown strength previously and then it's failed. This is the ASX industrial sector, and it was trading in consolidation mode this week within the range of the previous bar. You can see buying support emerged down here, and after some testing for supply, the market did push higher within the range of the previous bar for most of that week. And this week, the market's pulled back within the previous bar's range as an inside bar, and it's attempting to absorb any supply that's been drawn out. The breakdown line above is up here. That's going to be where you expect resistance to affect the market. And the market's pushed up to that level, and now it's consolidating just below it, attempting to absorb any supply and effectively opening the door for a push higher if that supply is proven to be low. At this point in time, volumes remain about the average, so it's genuine trading, but seeing the market was consolidating this week does suggest that there is still some supply in the market, and that may mean the market continues to move sideways for another week next week. This is the consumer staples sector, effectively supermarkets in Australia, and here's the highs of the range up here. The market did pull back. There is some sector rotation going on here. This is quite a defensive sector, and the market had been buoyant when prices were pulling back across the broader market, and there are some signs that the market has seen some selling pressure emerge, probably to go into other sectors. Price pulled back this week on a slight increase in volume, almost to the average. It did close about adjacent to the previous bar's low. So it's trying to hold on to that level. There's no doubt there's some supply in this market, but it's not overwhelming at this point in time. Just some modest selling pressure at best. And it's remaining intact to a large degree. And while the market may continue to drift lower next week, I don't expect it will accelerate lower, especially with the uncertainty going on around the world at this point in time. This is the ASX consumer discretionary sector, and this market did find some buying support over the last month. Last week it did attempt to push higher, and this week it's come back in consolidation mode within the range of the previous bar as an inside bar, and it's testing the breakout line, if you like, for strength. It's not a really serious breakout line, but there is some consolidation at this level, and the market's just pulled back. You can see volume increased to about average, so there was some supply drawn out, and the market is attempting to absorb that supply and doing a pretty good job at this point in time, it must be said. That's the highest volume for a month pretty much, and it's held on and respected the little breakout line there. So the markets are attempting to consolidate in response to the push higher last week. This is the ASX property sector. It also pushed higher this week. There was a test for supply below the previous bar's close, which is often what happens earlier in a week, especially when the previous bar is an up bar. It's just a little consolidation bar and testing the market to make sure that overwhelming supply isn't going to be drawn out in response to the push higher. So there was a test for supply this week below the previous bar's close, and then prices pushed higher in response. That's quite a good strong move. Breakdown lines up here, still plenty of room to move up there. Breakdown line above that comes through here. So you can see that the market's still got free air to move in up here before the real resistance emerges through here. I expect this market will probably test for supply again below the previous bar's close for a day or two next week. And if supply is not overwhelming, there may be an attempt to just push higher again, possibly up to the highs of the range, but it doesn't have to. We'll see. It depends how much supply is drawn out and whether trading conditions remain favourable. Just back to the parent index quickly, after seeing those charts, you can see that this market is consolidating in response to the strength that's been found over the last month or so, and prices trading up here. And in some respects, you've got a little bull flag forming there. There's the flagpole. There's the flag. These markets do like to test for supply early in the week, although there hasn't been an up bar this week. So that reduces the chance to some degree. But often on a Monday, the market will trade a little lower, at least early in the trading session, just to make sure that there's not overwhelming supply in the market for some reason. It's also going to respond at this point in time to trading on Friday night on overseas markets and any events that may have happened over the weekend, considering we're in a bit of a news-driven period at the moment with what's going on in the Middle East and around the world. And the market is highly reactive to what's going on, very sensitive to it. So look for a test for supply early, and then if supply is found to be low, there may be an attempt to continue higher. But if supply is being drawn out, you'll see a deeper pullback, probably within the range of the 2-week bar, and that will be an attempt to challenge the sellers. So there's a lot going on at the moment, but the markets continue to trade fairly logically, which is what you want to see. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.